He left her for her best friend on a Tuesday, and he did it in public, in front of a microphone, on the steps of a building that, as it turned out, he had never been legally permitted to sell. The building was called the Marchand Building. It had carried that name in raised bronze letters above its River North entrance since 1991. On this particular Tuesday morning in April of 2023, Preston Webb stood at those steps beside a woman named Tara Kimati, who had driven Solène to chemotherapy 6 weeks earlier, who had brought soup to her apartment twice, who had said, in the dark of a hospital waiting room, "I'm not going anywhere." And he announced to a gathered press contingent that the building was being rebranded. The Marchand name, he explained, would be coming down. Solène Marchand Webb was standing on the sidewalk below. She had come directly from a chemotherapy appointment. Her hands were cold. Her hat covered hair that the treatment had begun to take. She watched her husband at the microphone, and she watched her best friend of 19 years at his shoulder, and she noted, with the specific, unhurried attention of someone who has learned to notice the things that matter, that Preston was wearing the cufflinks she gave him for their 10th anniversary. His mother, Carol, stood to the side of the crowd. She did not look toward the sidewalk. What none of them knew, what no one in that crowd, holding their coffees in the April wind, could possibly have understood, was that Solène had held legal controlling interest in that building for 14 months. The bronze letters were not coming down. They never had been coming down. The acquisition Preston was announcing did not legally exist. She watched for 90 seconds. Then she turned and walked back to her car. If you have ever been underestimated by someone who should have known you better than anyone, this story is for you. Give it a like and subscribe, because the full story is something you need to hear to the end. Drop a comment and tell us where in the world you're watching from tonight. Now, to understand what Solène did next and why, we need to go back to where this story actually begins. Not with a marriage and not with a betrayal, but with a man named Rémy Marchand, and the building he built, and the daughter he prepared for a world that would one day try to take it from her. To understand what Solène did next, and why, we need to go back to where this story actually began. Not with a marriage, and not with a betrayal, but with a man named Rémy Marchand, and the building he built, and the daughter he prepared for a world that would one day try to take it from her. But first, the building itself. And the Tuesday morning it almost changed hands. Preston Webb had been rehearsing this moment for weeks. You could see it in the way he held the microphone. Not gripping it, which would betray nerves, but resting his hand around it with the deliberate ease of a man who has practiced casual. He wore a charcoal suit, a white shirt open at the collar. The April wind moved through his hair and he let it, because men like Preston understood that controlled dishevelment reads as confidence in a crowd. He smiled at the assembled journalists, the Apex Holdings representatives in their good coats, the building management staff who had been told to attend without being told why, and he began. Apex River North Tower, he said, represents the next chapter in what this block can be. The display board to his left held a rendering. Clean sans serif typography, a minimalist facade treatment, the kind of vision board architecture that photographs well and costs feelings to look at. At the top of the rendering, where the bronze letters had sat since 1991, the signage read, Apex River North Tower. The Marchand name had been crossed out in the mock-up. Not literally. There was no red line through it. The designer had simply replaced it, which is how erasure works when it wants to look like progress. Tara stood at Preston's right shoulder. She had her professional face on, attentive, composed, the slight forward lean of someone demonstrating investment in the proceedings. She was wearing the burgundy coat. She had her hands clasped in front of her. She did not look toward the sidewalk. She did not look anywhere except at the board and occasionally at Preston, with the comfortable alignment of two people who have spent significant time reading the same room. The small crowd applauded at the appropriate moment. Someone asked a question about the development timeline. Preston answered it smoothly, pivoting into projected occupancy figures, dropping the name of the architecture firm, as if the choice had been entirely his. Solène stood on the sidewalk and let it happen. She noted the cufflinks first, not because she'd forgotten them, but because seeing them here, in this context, completed something. Those cufflinks were platinum and square, with a small inlaid garnet on each face. She had chosen the garnets specifically because Preston, in the early years of the marriage, had once mentioned that his grandmother wore a garnet ring every day of her life, and that the color looked like something worth keeping. She had remembered that. He was wearing the remembering of it today, on the steps of her father's building, announcing the removal of her father's name. The irony was not lost on her. It settled instead into the same drawer where she kept all the things she was not yet finished with. She watched Carol Webb, positioned to the side of the crowd in a camel coat, her silver hair set perfectly against the collar. Carol was watching the journalists. She was not looking for Solène. It had simply not occurred to her that Solène would be here, which told Solène everything she needed to know about how thoroughly she had been written out of this story. Preston wrapped his remarks. More applause. Someone from Apex stepped forward to shake his hand. Tara smiled at something a man in a gray coat said to her. The morning continued being a morning, bright and indifferent, the lakefront wind cutting east down the block. Solène counted to 90. Then she turned and walked back to her car. She did not cry in the car. Her hands found the steering wheel and stayed there. Outside, through the windshield, the Marchand building stood as it had always stood, limestone and glass, its proportions exactly as her father had specified, its bronze letters unchanged above the entrance. Marchand Building. Raised from the stone, not affixed to it. Her father had insisted on that distinction during construction. Affixed can be removed, he had told the fabricator. Raised from the surface is part of the surface. The fabricator had thought he was being difficult. He had been being precise. She took her phone from her coat pocket. René answered before the second ring. I saw, René said. Are we ready? Solène said. It was not a question. We have been ready, René said, since 2020. The call lasted 11 seconds. Solène set the phone on the passenger seat and looked back up at the building. The letters had not moved. They would not move. Somewhere across the city, in a locked drawer in the offices of Okonkwo and Marchand LLP on North Michigan Avenue, a trust document sat with its page corners worn soft from reading, Clause 7C, underlined in pencil, her name on every relevant line. The building had belonged to her in the way that mattered most, for 14 months. It had belonged to her father before that for 32 years. Preston Webb had announced a transaction that did not legally exist, but to understand how Solène came to be sitting in that car, steady, certain, waiting, we have to go back much further than April of 2023. We have to go back to 1974, and a man who arrived in this city with $2,000 and a philosophy he intended to build with. Rémy Marchand arrived in Chicago on a Thursday in October of 1974 with $2,000 in a money belt, a philosophy degree from the University of Algiers, and a conviction that had survived the Atlantic crossing intact, that a building was not a product. It was a position. It was an argument made in stone and glass and proportion about what the people who entered it were worth. He spoke 4 languages with varying fluency, and English with the formal precision of someone who had learned it from books before he learned it from rooms. He found work first as a draftsman at a small firm on West Madison Street, then as a project manager, then, by 1979, as someone whose name appeared on permits alongside the firm's name, which was the first time he understood that a name on a document was a different kind of thing than a name on a paycheck. One was temporary, the other accumulated. In 1983, when the city's capital was flowing north and east and nowhere near Pilsen, Remy Marchand bought a vacant lot on West 18th Street for $62,000 and built a 4-story mixed-use building with limestone cladding and full-height windows on every residential floor. The contractor told him the windows were an unnecessary expense for that location. Remy told him that unnecessary was a word people used when they had already decided who deserved what. He kept the windows. Solène grew up watching her father build the way other children watched their parents garden, as a background condition of life, the reliable activity that explained the parent to you before you had language for it. She was on job sites in a yellow hard hat by the time she was 6. She could read a basic floor plan by 9. She understood load-bearing walls before she understood long division, which her father considered the correct order of priorities. The Marchand building went up in 1990 and was completed in the spring of 1991, when Solène was 9 years old. On the morning after the ribbon cutting, Remy took her through the lobby alone, before the tenants arrived, before the building had been broken in by ordinary use. He walked slowly, his large hands trailing the limestone walls the way a person touches something they want to confirm is real. Solène walked beside him, her small hand in his, her sneakers squeaking on the new terrazzo floor. At the entrance, he stopped and looked up at the bronze letters above the door. She looked up, too. "The name on the door isn't decoration, Solène," he said, in the measured cadence he used when he was telling her something he intended her to keep. "It's documentation." She nodded. She filed it in the place where she kept things that mattered before she knew why. She would not open that drawer for 32 years. What the audience needs to understand about Remy Marchand, and what Preston Webb never understood and never thought to ask, is that he was not a sentimental man. He was a precise one. Sentiment builds things for today. Precision builds things for the decade after you are gone. In 1991, the same year the building was completed, he had his attorney, a 30-year-old associate named René Okonkwo, who had just made partner at Okonkwo and Associates on North Michigan Avenue, draft the Marchand Family Trust. The trust held the building, the Pilsen property, and the ground lease position on a Lincoln Park site Remy was acquiring quietly that year. Clause 7C was Remy's own language. René told him it was unusual. He told her that unusual was another word people used when they had already decided what was possible. She kept the clause. It read, in the plain terms Remy always preferred, upon the trust beneficiary's 40th birthday, controlling interest in the Marchand building, defined as 51% of all ownership rights, decision-making authority, and disposition approval, transfers automatically and irrevocably to the beneficiary. No action required, no notification to third parties necessary. The birthday passes, and the transfer occurs, the way a season changes, without announcement, without ceremony, whether anyone notices or not. He updated the trust 3 times over the decades. Standard revisions, René said, each time. The last update was in 2020. That revision contained something the previous versions had not. A handwritten note, folded once, tucked inside the back cover of the trust document's physical copy. René did not read it. It was not addressed to her. She kept it in the locked drawer with the trust, where it sat for 3 years, waiting. What was in the note will have to wait a little longer. This story moves in the order things were built. and some foundations have to be laid before the structure makes sense. In 2009, Solène was 27 and running the small architectural consultancy she'd co-founded with Tara Kimathi, her college roommate and closest friend since their first week at Northwestern in 2000. Tara worked the rooms. Solène did the work that made the rooms worth working. It was a functional and genuine partnership, the kind that survives on complementary strengths and mutual respect, and the unspoken agreement not to examine the arrangement too carefully. That autumn, a commercial real estate broker named Preston Webb came to a client dinner Tara organized, and he sat across from Solène and spent the entire meal asking her questions about load-bearing structures, with the focused attention of a man who has identified something he wants and is determining the best approach. Tara watched from across the table. Afterward, walking to the car, she told Solène, "He's looking at you the way people look at buildings they want to own." They laughed. It seemed like a compliment. It was a warning dressed as one, which is the shape most warnings take when the person delivering them doesn't yet know that's what they're doing. The marriage, when it came, was real. That is the important thing to hold on to as this story continues. The early years were not a mistake to be explained away. Preston was sharp and present, and genuinely delighted by Solène's competence in a way that felt, then, like recognition. They moved into an apartment on North Dearborn Street, and Preston's velocity and Solène's depth made a livable atmosphere, the way temperature differential makes weather. There were dinner parties and weekend drives up the lakeshore, and mornings when the light came through the east windows, and everything felt, if not permanent, at least durable. Solène would sometimes watch Preston across a dinner table, his ease with rooms, his ability to make everyone present feel specifically seen, and think. This is what velocity looks like when it is pointed toward something good. She believed the speed would settle. She believed that what moved fast at 30 would find its natural pace at 40, the way rivers widen as they move toward larger bodies of water. She was still believing this the year her father died. That was the year the weather changed. Remy Marchand died on a Wednesday morning in November of 2018, in the bedroom of the Evanston house where Solène had grown up, with the lake visible through the east window and a site plan for a project he would not finish on the nightstand beside him. He had been ill for 14 months. He faced it the way he faced everything that could not be negotiated, with attention, without drama, his large hands still reaching for pencils even in the final weeks, when the drawings they produced were unsteady and small. Solène was with him. She held his hand until it was still. She did not cry at the hospital. She did not cry at the house, where Preston arrived 2 hours later and stood in the kitchen making phone calls in a hushed, efficient voice, managing the logistics of death with the same competence he brought to closing deals, which was its own kind of kindness and its own kind of distance. She cried once, alone, in her father's study at 2 a.m, sitting in the chair where he had spent 40 years deciding what to build next. Then she closed the door on it. She grieved the way her father built. From the inside out, load-bearing walls first, nothing visible until the structure could hold its own weight. Preston read her quietness as absence. This is the thing that is important to understand about what came next. Not that he stopped loving her, but that he stopped knowing how to be in the same room as her grief. He was a man who moved through the world at velocity, and grief does not move at velocity. It pools, it settles, it takes up residence in corners. Preston found himself, without making a conscious decision, spending more time in rooms that were warmer than the one his wife was in. The erosion was not dramatic. It never is, in marriages that matter. It was a slow accumulation of small wrongnesses, each one easy to explain away individually, each one adding its weight to the same side of a scale that was tipping incrementally, and then, decisively, away from her. He began talking over her at dinners. Not loudly, not rudely, just consistently redirecting, completing her sentences before she finished them, pivoting from her point to a better version of it that happened to be his. She noticed. She let it go. He canceled plans she had organized. Dinner reservations, gallery openings, a weekend with old friends from her Northwestern years, with apologies that were smooth and specific and delivered at the last possible moment. She rearranged. She did not complain. He began describing her architectural consultancy to people they met at events in the past tense, as if it were something she used to do. Solène had a design practice, had, not has, before the estate work became a full-time thing. She heard it 3 times before she understood it was not a slip. It was a narrative. He was writing her out of her own professional life, one dinner party conversation at a time, and the audience for that narrative was their entire social world. It was around this time that Carol Webb began appearing. Preston's mother was a small, immaculate woman who had spent 30 years as a regional sales director and retired with the posture of someone who had simply moved her performance to a different stage. She measured people the way she had once measured quarterly targets, against visible markers of success, and never in their favor until proven otherwise. She had tolerated Solène in the good years of the marriage, with the specific tolerance of a woman who suspects the books will eventually be rebalanced in her direction. After Rémi's death, when Solène's quietness gave the apartment a different atmosphere, Carol began arriving without invitation, for lunch, for coffee, once for an entire Saturday afternoon, during which she reorganized the kitchen with the cheerful authority of someone doing an obvious favor. "She just seems so tired lately," Carol told a mutual friend, at a lunch Solène was not at. "I worry about her. I really do." She let the sentence rest there, with all its implications intact. She did not need to finish it. Carol Webb was too skilled for that. Tara filled space differently. She arrived with energy and noise, and the genuine warmth of someone who had known Solène for 18 years, and could not, quite yet, imagine choosing differently. She organized dinners. She pulled Solène to exhibitions and concerts with the cheerful insistence of someone who believes motion is medicine. Solène went. She was grateful. She did not yet know what she was grateful for, or what it was costing. Then, somewhere in the middle of 2021, something shifted. It was not one thing. It was the accumulation of small geometries that didn't quite align. Tara canceling their standing Thursday lunch 3 weeks in a row, each time with an explanation slightly more specific than the situation required. A client call in one case, a contractor walkthrough in another, and once a dentist appointment rescheduled to exactly the time they were meant to meet, which was precise in the way that only deliberate alibis are precise. Preston's calendar, which he kept open on his laptop, and which Solène had never thought to examine, blocked out Sunday mornings in a recurring event simply labeled Site Review, on every Sunday for 4 months, without a single address or project name attached. And then one evening in September, standing in the kitchen while Preston sat at the counter responding to messages, Solène glanced at his phone screen as she passed. The name at the top of the thread was Tara. The message visible was 3 words, and they were not professional. She did not stop. She did not ask. She carried 2 glasses of water to the table and sat down, and her hands, beneath the surface of the cloth, closed slowly around each other until her knuckles were white, and then released. She told herself, "You may be wrong. Grief distorts. Exhaustion distorts. The tendency toward interiority that her father gave her, which was her greatest strength and sometimes her greatest liability, could build a case from materials that didn't warrant one. She owed him the benefit of a doubt she no longer entirely believed in." She told herself this. She kept telling herself this. She was still telling herself this when the doubt became impossible to maintain. But that came later. First came something worse than suspicion. First came the institutional moves, the quiet, systematic kind that don't look like cruelty until you examine what they've taken. The doubt had been building for months when Preston made his first institutional move. It did not announce itself as a move. It announced itself as concern. It was a Sunday in October of 2022, early evening, the kind of quiet that settles over apartments when the week ahead is already pressing against the present. Preston had been looking at his laptop at the kitchen counter, and when Solène came in from the study where she'd spent the afternoon reviewing the Pilsen property's annual maintenance assessments, he closed the screen partway and turned to her with an expression she had learned to recognize over 13 years of marriage. The expression of a man who has decided something and is now presenting it as a conversation. "I think you should let me take over the joint account management," he said. "Just for now. You've been exhausted. I don't want you to have to think about it." She looked at him. He held her gaze easily, the way he held every gaze, with the practiced openness of someone who has nothing to hide, because he has already hidden it. "I'm fine," she said. "I know you're fine," he said. "I just want to help." The restructuring happened incrementally over the following 6 weeks. First, the joint operating account, rebalanced so that Preston's signature was required on transfers above $2,000. Then the building management correspondence, a request, apparently routine, to add Preston Webb as an authorized contact on the Marchand Building's property management account with Lakeshore Asset Services on East Ontario Street. The property manager, a competent man named Gerald Fitch, who had been managing the building since 2014, and who knew Solène as the person who actually read his quarterly reports, processed the addition without question. He had no reason to question it. It looked like a couple updating shared administrative access. It was a husband inserting his name into a building he did not own. Solène did not block it. She noted it. She added it to the file she was building in the part of herself where she kept the things that mattered before she knew exactly why. What she did not know yet, what the audience should understand even if she didn't, was that this was the same month Preston's attorneys at Callaway Fitch LLP first began drafting the Apex acquisition structure in earnest. The building management access and the acquisition paperwork were moving in parallel, on separate tracks, both heading toward the same destination. While Preston was positioning himself as a caring husband, managing his wife's administrative burden, Callaway Fitch was drafting a transaction that required him to control something he was only pretending to have authority over. The irony, as the narrator will note, is not subtle. Then came Carol. Carol Webb did not attend the lunch at Spiaggia on East Ohio Street on the third Thursday of November 2022. She hosted it. 8 women, most of them from the social circle that Preston's professional success had built around them over the previous decade, the kind of circle that is built from professional adjacency and maintained through regular performance of ease. Solène was not invited. The explanation, if anyone had been asked to provide one, would have been that it was a small gathering, spontaneous, nothing formal. This was not entirely untrue. It was simply not entirely the point. What Carol said at that lunch was said with the specific texture of someone who is expressing reluctant concern. "I worry about Solène, I do. She's not herself. She's been struggling since Remy died, and I don't think she's ever really recovered." A pause. A small adjustment of the fork. "Preston tries so hard, he really does." And then, folded inside a sentence about the difficulty of watching someone you love decline, the word unstable. Used once, carefully, in a subordinate clause. Not diagnosed, not defined, just placed on the table like an item of evidence and left there for the room to examine. Solène heard about it 10 days later from a woman named Diane Chu, who had been at the lunch and who was, of all the people in that circle, the only one who thought Solène deserved to know. Diane called, hesitated through the preamble, and then told her precisely what had been said, and how it had been said, and what the room's silence had implied in response. Solène thanked her. She hung up. Her hand stayed flat on the desk for a long moment before she moved it. This is when she called Dr. Amara Solis's office and asked whether she could move up the follow-up appointment. There had been some imaging 3 weeks prior, precautionary, for fatigue and a swollen lymph node behind her left ear that had not resolved in the expected time. She had not thought much about it. She thought about it now. On a Tuesday morning in early March of 2023, Dr. Solis sat across from Solène in an examination room on the 11th floor of Northwestern Memorial and told her, in the clear and non-euphemistic language Solène had always appreciated in her, that the imaging indicated early-stage lymphoma. Treatable. Caught early. The word she used most often was manageable. Solène sat with this for 3 days before she told anyone. She did not tell Preston. She did not tell Tara. She told Renee Okonkwo, who received the information with a brief silence, and then said, "Do you want to discuss the timeline for the filing?" Solène said yes. They discussed it. What Solène observed in those 2 weeks before she told Preston, Apex Holdings filed 2 amended exhibits with Callaway Fitch's escrow coordination team. Tara's phone appeared in Preston's recent calls list on a Wednesday evening, twice, for a combined duration of 41 minutes, while he was ostensibly on a client call in the study. The building management correspondence from Lakeshore Asset Services shifted entirely to Preston's email, with Solène's address quietly removed from the CC line. Neither of them knew she was watching. This is the important thing. They had decided she was not capable of watching, and so they had stopped being careful. She told Preston about the diagnosis on a Friday afternoon, sitting at the kitchen table, her hands folded in her lap the way her father had taught her to hold things that needed to be held carefully. Preston's response arrived in the correct order: shock, then softness, then the firm and practical reassurance of a man who is good at managing situations. He held her. He said all the right things. He did not cancel the Apex timeline meeting scheduled for the following Monday, but she had not expected him to. Tara arrived 2 days later with a container of French lentil soup and a bottle of good wine, and the kind of focused warmth she deployed in the moments that mattered most to her, the moments when presence was a form of investment. She sat across from Solène at the kitchen table and cried, apparently genuinely, when Solène described the treatment schedule. Her hands covered Solène's over the table. Her eyes were full. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. The door closed behind her 40 minutes later. Solène sat alone in the kitchen, with the soup on the counter and the wine unopened and her hands very still in her lap, and she thought about what her father had always said, that the most important information is not what people tell you, but what they do when they believe you are not watching. She had been watching. She had been watching for a long time. The morning of April the 4th began the way Solène's Tuesday mornings had begun for 8 weeks, in a treatment chair on the 4th floor of Northwestern Memorial, a needle in the crook of her left arm, her hat pulled low over the close-cropped stubble that was all that remained of her natural hair. The infusion took 3 hours. She read during the first hour a property law review she had been working through in sections, and looked out the window during the second, watching the city move against its own reflection in the glass. During the third hour, she sat with her hands folded in her lap and thought about nothing in particular, which was something she had learned to do during chemotherapy, the way her father had learned to do it on long job sites, as a form of patience that was also a form of preparation. The nurse, Angela Morris, removed the IV line at 11:47 and asked her how she felt. Solène said fine, thank you, and meant it. She was thinner than she had been in October. Her soft curves had reduced to angles she was still learning to recognize in the mirror, and her full arms, which she had always covered beneath sleeves, looked different now. More deliberate somehow, as if the treatment had stripped away something optional and left only what was structural. She put on her coat in the corridor, pulled her hat over her ears, and walked to the elevator. The Marchand building was 7 minutes from the hospital by car. She had not planned to go there. Her body simply went, the way you drive a route you have driven for 30 years without deciding to. She parked on the street, half a block north. Through the windshield she could see the gathering at the entrance steps, not large, perhaps 25 people, journalists and associates, and the kind of professionally attentive crowd that assembles when an announcement has been pre-organized to appear spontaneous. There was a display board to the left of the steps. She could not read the text from where she sat, but she could see the design. Clean, minimal, the proportions of a rebranding that had been in preparation for months. She got out of the car. The April wind came off the lake in a long, cold slide, and she stood at the edge of it, one hand in her coat pocket, hat low, standing at the margin of a crowd that was not looking for her. Now the scene has context. Now every element of it has weight. Preston stood at the top of the entrance steps in a charcoal suit and spoke with the easy authority of a man who has rehearsed the performance of spontaneity. He talked about vision. He talked about the building's potential, which was a specific kind of violence, implying, with each sentence, that what the building had been was less than what it would become. He was wearing the cufflinks she had chosen because of his grandmother's ring, because of something he had said once about the color garnet and what it meant to keep something. 13 years of the specific attention of a woman who listened. He was wearing it at the microphone today. Tara stood at his right shoulder. She stood the way she always stood in professional contexts. Spine straight, weight forward, the forward lean of full investment in whatever room she was in. The burgundy coat moved at the hem in the wind, and she did not reach down to stop it. She had not moved a single degree toward the sidewalk since the event began. This was not oversight. Tara was precise about where she placed her attention. Here is what the audience already knows that the people applauding do not. That Tara Kimathi stood in the chemotherapy waiting room for 4 hours in February with a paperback open in her lap, and that her brokerage commission in the Apex acquisition structure was $4.2 million, contingent on close. $4.2 million. She drove Solène to her first infusion appointment. She brought French lentil soup. She held Solène's hands over the kitchen table and cried when Solène described the treatment schedule. Every one of those gestures was made against a $4.2 million interest in the outcome of this moment. This press announcement, this microphone, this crossed-out name on the rendering she had helped Preston's design team commission. The display board. Solène looked at it directly now. Apex River North Tower. The name in clean sans serif, the proportions carefully considered by someone who understood design, but not what the design was replacing. At the top of the building's rendered facade, the space where the bronze letters had been was simply empty, not struck through, not acknowledged, erased. As if the name had never existed. As if the argument her father had spent 40 years making in limestone and proportion and full-height windows had been merely preliminary, a rough draft that the real version was now superseding. Something tightened in her chest. Not loudly, but completely. Carol Webb stood to the right of the main gathering, at a distance that allowed for a clear sight line to the journalist cluster and to Preston's face. She wore the camel coat. Her silver hair was set perfectly. She watched the crowd with the focused attention of a woman monitoring a performance she has helped choreograph, which is what she was doing. Her eyes moved from journalist to journalist, from Preston to Tara, from the display board to the applauding faces. They did not move to the sidewalk. It had simply not occurred to her that Solène would be standing on it. She had written Solène out of this scene weeks ago, in her assessment of who was capable of participating in events that mattered. Solène stood in the April wind and let every element of the scene land where it needed to land. The cufflinks, the coat, the empty space where the name had been. Carol's precise and deliberate placement in the crowd. The applause from people who did not know what they were applauding. She counted. Not because she needed to, but because she had learned from her father that precision was its own form of respect, for the situation, for yourself, for the decision you were already making. She counted to 90. Then she turned and walked back to her car. She did not rush. She did not look back. Her hands were cold, and she put them in her coat pockets, and she walked at the pace of someone who has already completed the most important part of what they came to do, which, in a sense, she had. In the car, she sat for a moment before starting the engine. Through the windshield, the Marchand building stood where it had stood since 1991. The bronze letters above the entrance read, as they had always read, exactly what her father put there. They had not moved. They would not move. The building did not know what had just been announced on its steps, and it did not need to. Documentation does not require witnesses to remain true. She was not finished. She had not yet begun. She did not go home. She sat in the car for 3 minutes after starting the engine, the Marchand building still visible in the rearview mirror. And then she pulled into traffic, heading south. Not towards the apartment on North Dearborn. South, through the grid of the city, down through the loop and across the river, and into the neighborhoods that the city's capital had spent 40 years pretending did not exist until they could no longer afford to ignore them. She drove the way her father had taught her to drive through Chicago, paying attention to what the city was doing, not just where you were going. The Marchand South Yards sat on West 18th Street in Pilsen, a 4-story building with limestone cladding and full-height windows on every residential floor. The same full-height windows the contractor had told her father were an unnecessary expense in 1983, and which had been letting in the same quality of light ever since. Solène parked in the small lot adjacent to the building and turned off the engine and sat looking at it. She had not been here in 6 weeks. The last time she had been dropping off a maintenance assessment for Marcus Diallo, who managed the property with the same patient competence he had brought to it for 11 years. She had stood in the parking lot for a few minutes that day, too, looking at the building the way you look at something that is itself a form of argument. Her father had believed that every building was, that every decision about proportion and material and threshold was a statement about what the people inside were worth. He had made that argument here first, in 1983, in a neighborhood where nobody else was making it. The building had been making it ever since, in the only language that outlasts its builders, the language of what was actually built. A memory surfaced. She was 12, and her father had brought her here on a Saturday morning to look at a plumbing repair he was reviewing. It was winter, and the lobby was warm in the way that well-insulated buildings are warm, not heated to excess, but protected from the cold, which is a different thing. One of the tenants, an older woman whose name Solène had since forgotten, had been in the lobby when they arrived, and had thanked Remy in a way that was specific and unhurried, the gratitude of someone who had been treated well for long enough that it no longer surprised them, but still warranted acknowledgement. He had listened to her completely. He had not looked at his watch. When they left, he had said nothing about it, which was, Solène understood only later, its own kind of instruction. She understood it now. not as sentiment, but as architecture. The building was the argument, and the argument held because it had been built correctly, and it would continue to hold whether or not anyone acknowledged it, whether or not anyone remembered who had built it, whether or not someone else put their name on the door. The name on the door isn't decoration, it's documentation. Solène said it aloud in the car, alone, on a Tuesday afternoon in April, and the sentence landed differently than it ever had before. Not as something her father told her, not as something she found in a margin, as something she knew with the specific certainty of a person who has been tested by the weight a thing was built to bear and found it holding. She was 41 years old. She had been carrying her father's name in a trust document for 14 months. She had sat in chemotherapy chairs and soup delivery kitchens and a sidewalk in the April wind, and the document had held through all of it, unchanged, waiting. Documentation does not require witnesses. It requires only that it was done correctly in the first place. Her father had done it correctly. She was her father's daughter. She would do this correctly too. Something settled in her chest, not loudly, and not with the relief of something ending, but with the particular solidity of a decision that has moved from being considered to being made. She took her phone from her coat pocket. She found the number. She called. Renee answered on the second ring. "The filing," Solène said. "Are we ready?" "The controlling interest claim is clean," Renee said. "The consolidation documents are fully executed on my end. The right of first refusal exercise is prepared and dated. We need one instruction from you." "File everything," Solène said. "File it now." "Filing everything," Renee said. "Consider it done." The call lasted 47 seconds. Solène set the phone on the passenger seat. She looked at the building for another moment, at the full-height windows, at the limestone, at the 4 floors her father had built when nobody believed this neighborhood was worth building in, and then she started the car and drove home. The apartment was quiet when she arrived. Preston was not there. His absence had its own texture now, familiar and no longer requiring interpretation. She hung up her coat. She put the kettle on. She did not look at her phone. She did not call anyone. She made tea in the plain, white mug she had owned since graduate school and carried it to the corner of the apartment where her father's drafting stool stood. The one piece of his furniture she had kept, which she had always kept, the one that had traveled with her from the Evanston house to her first apartment to this one, its worn oak surface holding the record of 40 years of a man who had never once sat down to make a drawing without intending it to become something real. She sat on it. She held the mug in both hands. Through the east-facing window, the city continued its work. Somewhere 7 minutes north of where she was sitting, the Marchand building stood with its bronze letters above the door, unchanged, waiting for a title transfer that was never going to come through. She was not frightened. She was not impatient. She was steady in the way of structures that have been correctly built, which is to say she was her father's, and she had always been her father's, and no one had ever successfully argued otherwise in any document that actually held. She waited. 6 weeks passed. Then the filing landed, and the world Preston Webb had been building on borrowed ground began, quietly and irreversibly, to come apart. The City of Chicago Department of Planning and Development occupied the 5th floor of a building on West Washington Street that had the particular atmosphere of a place designed for consequence. Low ceilings, good acoustics, conference rooms with long tables and windows that let in north light without warmth. The title transfer review for the Apex Holdings acquisition of the Marchand building had been scheduled for 9 o'clock on a Tuesday morning in June of 2023. It had been calendared as routine. It was not going to be routine. Preston arrived at 8:50 with his attorney, a senior partner at Callaway Fitch, LLP, named Richard Haas, who had been managing the Apex acquisition structure for 4 months, and who believed, as of that morning, that the proceeding ahead of him was a formality, a regulatory sign-off on a deal that was already structurally complete. He carried a leather portfolio embossed with the Callaway Fitch crest. He had done this before. He projected the easy competence of a man who expected the room to cooperate. Preston sat to Haas's left. He was wearing a charcoal suit, no tie. He looked, as he always looked in professional settings, like someone who belonged there. Settled, readable, the particular ease of a man who has learned that rooms respond to confidence whether or not it is warranted. Across the table sat 2 representatives from the city's review office, a senior analyst named Kevin Park, and a title examiner named Diane Worthington, who had been working property transfers in Chicago for 19 years. Then the door opened. Renee Okonkwo entered first, which was always how she entered rooms that mattered, compact, unhurried, dressed in the dark charcoal that she wore to proceedings the way a surgeon wears a particular instrument, with intention. She carried a document portfolio that was thicker than Richard Haas's by approximately 300 pages. She set it on the table without looking at anyone. Solène entered behind her. She had completed her final chemotherapy session 8 days prior. She was thin in the way that a structure is thin when what is unnecessary has been removed, and what remains is precisely what was always doing the work. Her close-cropped hair had begun its return, and she had left the hat at home. She wore a cream blazer, a white shirt, dark trousers. She moved to the chair beside Renee, and sat down and placed her own portfolio on the table and opened it and uncapped the pen she had brought. The pen her father had given her when she turned 21, a plain matte black instrument he'd had inscribed on the barrel with a single word, Marchand. And she looked at the table in front of her, and was still. Preston looked at her. His expression moved through 3 phases in approximately 2 seconds: recognition, confusion, and recalibration. The recalibration was the most interesting of the 3, because it was the first evidence that something in the room was different from what he had prepared for. He looked at Renee. He looked back at Solène. He said nothing. Kevin Park called the proceeding to order. Renee spoke first. She introduced herself, Renee Okonkwo, and Marchand LLP. And then she introduced her client. And here is where the room changed, because she did not say Solène Webb. She said Solène Marchand. Solène's legal name on every trust document, every property record, every filing Renee had prepared since 1991. The name her father put on the door. Not Webb. Never Webb. Marchand. Richard Haas looked up from his portfolio. He looked at Renee with the expression of a man who is beginning to understand that the meeting he prepared for is not the meeting he is in. Renee placed the first document on the table. The Marchand Family Trust, dated 1991, with Clause 7C, tabbed in blue. She summarized it in 4 sentences, which was exactly 4 more sentences than it required, but she was providing it for the record. Upon the beneficiary's 40th birthday, 51% controlling interest in the Marchand building transferred automatically and irrevocably. Solène Marchand's 40th birthday was February 3, 2022. The transfer had occurred. It was documented. It had been documented, she said, since that morning, in the office of Okonkwo and Marchand LLP, in a locked drawer, since the day it took effect. 14 months ago, the complete duration of the Apex acquisition negotiation. The room was very quiet. Renee placed the second document. The chain of title analysis, 47 pages, demonstrating that no disposition of the Marchand building could proceed without Solène Marchand's written consent as the 51% controlling interest holder, and that no such consent had been given, and that the right of first refusal established in Clause 7D had been formally exercised by Okonkwo and Marchand LLP on behalf of Solène Marchand on the date of the original filing 6 weeks prior. Richard Haas was writing something rapidly on a legal pad. His handwriting was not, in that moment, the handwriting of a man in control of the narrative. Renee placed the third document. The Kimathi Vance Contingency Brokerage Agreement, which named Tara Kimathi as the transaction broker for the Apex acquisition with a contingency commission of $4.2 million, payable at close. She noted for the record that close had not occurred and would not occur, and that the commission structure was relevant to establishing the nature of all parties' interests in the transaction. She said this without inflection. She moved on. Preston had not spoken. He was looking at the table in front of him. His portfolio sat unopened. Richard Haas leaned toward him and said something in a low voice, and Preston did not respond in a way that suggested he had heard it. Then Renee placed the fourth document. The acquisition timeline cross-referenced against medical records from Northwestern Memorial, establishing that during the period when Preston Webb had described his wife as stepping back from business due to health issues, the period between March and June of 2023, Solène Marchand had executed the Clause 7C, ownership assertion, instructed the filing of the controlling interest claim, reviewed and approved the complete $3 billion consolidation documentation prepared by Okonkwo and Marchand LLP, and attended 8 rounds of chemotherapy. The document contained a date-stamped log from Renee's own files showing every communication she and Solène had exchanged during that period. There were 43 entries. Not one of them described a woman stepping back from anything. Richard Haas asked for a recess. Kevin Park said the proceeding would pause for 15 minutes. Preston looked up. He looked across the table. The room was still. Solène was finishing a note in the margin of the document in front of her, in the unhurried way of someone who is doing precise work and will not be rushed. Preston said her name. He said it the way a person says a word when they are no longer certain what it means. She finished the note. She capped the pen. She looked up. The expression on his face was something she had not seen from him in years. Not anger, not performance, but the specific, unguarded look of a man who has, in one terrible and clarifying moment, understood the complete shape of what he failed to understand, who he was married to, what he was standing on, what he had tried to erase. She looked at him with the calm of someone who has been waiting a long time and is no longer waiting. "My father put my name on this building before I could read it," she said. "I've been ready since then." The room did not react. It absorbed the sentence the way a well-built structure absorbs weight, without drama, because it was designed for exactly this. Kevin Park confirmed. The title transfer was denied. The right of first refusal exercise was valid and legally controlling. The acquisition could not proceed. Renee began gathering documents. She aligned the edges carefully before placing them in her portfolio, because Renee Okonkwo was precise even when no one was watching, and especially when they were. She closed the portfolio. She looked at Kevin Park and thanked him for his time. She stood. Solène stood beside her. She did not look at Preston again. She did not look at Richard Haas. She picked up her pen, the pen with her name on it, and placed it in the inside pocket of her blazer close to her chest, and followed Renee to the door. The conference room was still silent when they reached it. Outside, on West Washington Street, the June morning was warm and bright in the way that Chicago mornings are sometimes warm and bright after a long winter, suddenly, completely, as if the city had simply decided. Renee walked beside Solène to the car. Neither of them spoke for half a block. Then Renee said, "The consolidation papers are ready for your signature. Friday, if you want." Solène said yes. Friday. They walked the rest of the way in the specific silence of two people who have just done exactly what they prepared to do and know it, and need nothing more said about it. Behind them, on the 5th floor of the building on West Washington Street, a conference room remained quiet, in the way rooms go quiet when something has been resolved, rather than simply decided. Richard Haas was still writing on his legal pad. Preston Webb was looking at the window, at the city outside, at the particular light of a June morning in a city he had spent 14 years moving through at the pace of a man who thought he knew its terrain. He was beginning to understand that he did not. The consequences arrived in the order that structural failures always arrive. Not all at once, but in sequence, each one revealing the next, each one clarifying how much had been built on a foundation that was never there. By Wednesday, 2 days after the proceeding, the financial press had the story. The filing was public record. The headline in Crane's Chicago Business read, "Apex Holdings Acquisition Blocked by Spousal Ownership Claim." Marchand Building title, "Transfer Denied." The piece ran 400 words and was accurate in every particular, which was the most devastating thing about it. It did not need to editorialize. The facts were sufficient. Preston Webb, founding partner of Apex Holdings, had attempted to acquire a building in which his wife held 51% controlling interest, had done so while describing her publicly as stepping back from business due to illness, and had structured bridge loans against the building's projected acquisition value. Loans that were now in default review because the asset they were drawn against had not transferred and was not going to transfer. Richard Haas at Callaway Fitch had no comment. By Thursday, Apex Holdings had issued a withdrawal notice on the acquisition. The two institutional investors who had been considering positions in the deal declined to proceed. The bridge loans entered formal default review on Friday morning. The same morning, Renee called Solène at 9 o'clock and said, "The consolidation documents are ready, whenever you're prepared." Solène said she was prepared now. She signed in Renee's office at 11, the pen with her name on its barrel moving across the signature line of the $3 billion estate consolidation with the particular steadiness of a hand that is doing what it was always going to do. The Martian Trust, the South Yards Complex, the Lincoln Park ground lease, the development endowment, all of it consolidated, documented, and hers. By Friday afternoon, it was complete. Carol Webb called the apartment once on Thursday and once on Friday and received no answer. On Saturday she arrived in person, which was the Carol Webb of the early years of the marriage, the version who operated through access, who believed that physical presence conferred authority. She rang the bell. There was no response. On Monday she received a message through the attorneys at Okonkwo and Marchand LLP, informing her that all future communications regarding any matter related to the estate or the separation proceedings should be directed to the attorneys directly. She did not call the apartment again. She was a woman who did not put herself in rooms where she could not perform, and the room that had been waiting for her had no stage she recognized. Tara Kimathi's Saturday call came at 9:14 in the morning. Solène's phone was on the kitchen counter, and she was standing at the window with her tea, watching the June light come off the buildings to the east. And she watched the name appear on the screen, and she watched it ring, and she did not move toward it. She did not send it to voicemail. She simply watched it ring until it stopped, the way you watch weather that has already moved through and is no longer your weather. Tara did not call again. This was the most honest thing she did in the story, and the most final. Preston came on a Sunday evening, 9 days after the proceeding. He knocked rather than using his key, which told Solène everything about what had shifted in his own understanding of where he stood. She opened the door. He was thinner than he'd been in April, and the ease that had always been his primary instrument, the settled confidence, the room-reading grace, was absent in a way that made him look, for the first time, like the age he was. He told her he had made a mistake. He said it simply, which was the most unpersoned thing she had heard him say in years. She looked at him for a moment, at the man she had made a life with, at the specific face of someone who has finally arrived at an understanding that came 14 months too late, and she felt neither triumph nor grief. She felt the particular quiet of a door that has been properly closed. "The attorneys will handle everything from here," she said. He stood in the doorway a moment longer. Then he left. She closed the door and stood in the hallway and breathed, once, and went back to the kitchen. 1 week later, on a Tuesday evening in late June, she took the elevator to the 14th floor of the Marchand building and unlocked her father's office and went inside without turning on the overhead light. The office was unchanged. It had been unchanged since the last time Remy sat in it, in the autumn of 2020, when he had come in one final time to review the documents Renee had prepared and to leave the note that had been waiting ever since. The cedar pencil smell was the first thing, that specific, clean scent of a tool used precisely and put away correctly, which was as close to a description of her father as any single detail could offer. His drafting stool stood in the corner. The site plans from the Lincoln Park project he never finished were still rolled in the tube on the shelf. The chair at the desk still held the particular impression of 40 years of a man who sat there with intention. She sat in it. From her coat pocket she took the envelope Renee had given her on the morning of the filing, the one Renee had kept sealed for 3 years because it was not addressed to her. She had been carrying it since that morning. She had been waiting for the right room. This was the right room. The note inside was a single folded page in her father's handwriting, the deliberate, formal script of a man who had learned to write in French and carried its precision into every language he used afterward. It was dated October 14th, 2020. It said, "I have updated the documents for the last time. Everything is in order. You will know when to use it because you have always known." And then, at the bottom of the page, in the same measured hand that had written trust instruments and site plans, and the argument of every building he ever built. "The name on the door isn't decoration, Solène. It's documentation." She read it once. She read it again, slowly, the way you read something that was written for you before you knew you would need it. She folded the note. She held it in both hands in the last of the evening light, which came through the east-facing windows at a low angle and fell across the desk and the drafting stool and the rolled site plans and everything that her father had left here, intact, waiting, exactly as he built it. Outside, Chicago was doing what it always did, arguing, building, moving at the pace of a city that has no interest in anyone's private accounting of what was lost and what remained. The Marchand building was part of that city, as it had been since 1991, its bronze letters unchanged above the entrance, its proportions exactly as her father specified, its argument still standing. This is what the story is actually about. Not a transaction, and not a document, and not a man who underestimated the woman he was married to. It is about the difference between power that needs to be seen to exist and power that simply exists, whether or not anyone is watching. It is about the names we inherit and what we do when someone tries to take them. It is about the patience that looks, from the outside, exactly like absence, and turns out to have been the work itself. Remy Marchand built things that would outlast him. He built one of them in limestone, and one of them in law, and one of them in a daughter who knew, before she knew what it meant, that a name on a door was not there to be admired. It was there to be used. If you've watched this story and recognized something in it, the slow diminishment, the patience required to hold what is yours when others are certain you've already let it go. We want to hear from you. tell us in the comments. What does it mean to you to hold your ground quietly? And as always, tell us where in the world you're watching from tonight. Solène sat in her father's chair as the light failed. She did not turn on the lamp. She let the city's light, coming off the glass of the buildings to the east, be sufficient, which it was. The note stayed in her hands. The building held. She was not celebrating. There was nothing to celebrate in the ordinary sense, only something to acknowledge, the way you acknowledge a structure that has borne its weight correctly, without fanfare, because that is what it was built for. She breathed.